Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode in the saga of our research into the virgin birth account. And we have a supplement now to episode one. The topic is: Does Apostle John betray facts? There was no virgin birth. This is part two. And before we get there, we need to understand that what seems incredulous is to believe that there was an earlier period in time prior to 150 where the original New Testament did not have the virgin birth, and then it's being added around 140, 150, and now there's no trace of any evidence prior to that time anymore. And this is something, it's sort of a hidden secret from Christians that we are not told about what I'm going to show you now. All right, so let's read this article. This is from an article entitled "The Historicity of Paul the Apostle" in 2005 by Richard Carrier. And we're going to show you this is a well-known fact. If we'll get into more detail in a minute. In fact, there are almost zero documents period up to this period of 150. The history of the Christian church before 150 AD has been scrubbed almost entirely clean. Tons of documentation and books that would have existed were destroyed. OAH chapter 8.4. So more detail is in that book. And this is in the article. All we have left is what's in the canon and a few stragglers beyond. Among those stragglers, several do in fact mention Paul. The letter of First Clement attests to Paul's existence and his body of letters, and is ignorant of later legends placing Paul's death in Rome. Clement places it in Spain. So I wanted to say that this author shows a lot of guts, because everyone wants to believe Paul was martyred in Rome, and I've told you that we discovered in it was in the 1600s, somebody hands us the Alexandrinus Bible, and in there is First Clement. It's been lost and destroyed in history. It was one of those books that had to be expurged, and one of the reasons it probably had to be expurged, it had told the true date of death of Paul, and I told you that, and the place of death, most importantly, because he was placed as an alleged martyr with Peter in Rome, which never happened. And there's 4 different accounts of allegedly how it happened, which is exactly proof that it didn't ever happen in any of those ways or at all in Rome. That's what happens when people are lying. That letter is traditionally dated to 90s AD, although I and some other scholars concur the evidence suggests the year 66. And I would say that's correct, because inside the letter, it says the sacrifices, inside of First Clement, it says the sacrifices are still continuing at the temple in Jerusalem. Ergo, you couldn't possibly have the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, so you can't have that being later. So this is one of the earliest documents and one of the only documents that survives prior to 150 AD. So you can say, what about the Gospels? Nope, they were destroyed too. Everything's systematically destroyed. That's what we're talking about. Somebody, you can rewrite history if you're allowed to do this power, and I'm going to show you a little bit more on that in a second. And here's a archaeologist. So this is a more neutral person than a Christian. John Bartram, archaeologist for 50 years. He was asked a question on Quora. He said, "What evidence is there that the early church deliberately falsified or destroyed documents about the classical ancient world?" And I took just what I thought would be relevant to what I'm trying to show you. All the ancient manuscripts entering monastic scriptoria disappeared, never to be seen again. This resulted in the loss of the history of the cult of Christianity. I suppose he's not a Christian, which began in the early first century. In turn, this allowed the Church of Rome to later invent Christianity, placing it in those early centuries and misappropriating its sacred texts and symbols, such as the Cairo for itself. So that's essentially dynamite facts if you understand the consequence of what they're saying. So when you think you're reading a document that's dated 150, 160, 170, all those documents, and even later into the 200s, even to early 300s, they're all being fabricated. They're all being rewritten. All of the Greek works were retranslated. Many of the Greek works were retranslated into Latin by Rufinus. And the minute he finished that job, he destroyed the Greek manuscripts. And now you had to trust him that he hadn't corrupted the texts. And now we know he was a corrupter, primarily to endorsed the Trinity doctrine on people who were anti-Trinitarians. Like Origen was anti-Trinitarian. He comes out looking Trinitarian. And how did we know? We found the Greek manuscripts only in the last, quarter century. And yet debates went on for hundreds of years, where Origen was cited as a Trinitarian voice early in the church in the 200s. And so there's no level of despicable, unethical behavior by the Trinitarian leadership, not the people in the pew. They don't know, and they're debating these things, assuming they're real. They're not real. It's like smoke and mirrors. And so this is something we need to understand. It's a concept we don't understand. Oh, and I just wanted to mention, in the earliest manuscripts, the first mention of any birth of Jesus Christ in chronological time, meaning a document. What's the oldest document that mentions his birth? This is it. This is all there is. Okay, 150 A.D., Justin Martyr. When the child was born in Bethlehem, since Joseph could not find a lodging in that village, he took up his quarters in a certain cave near the village, and while they were there, Mary brought forth the Christ and placed him in a manger. Nothing about a virgin birth account, nothing special, just he's born. That's it. You see the difference when you find that one document. This is the earliest document we can find. It's he dies in 165, so he's born in 100. They think this is around 150, right about the period where some documents start not being destroyed, but everything before that has systematically been removed. And I wanted to show you a picture. Do you see how this is Stalin standing next to a person who was in favor at one time, but now the same picture has the person who used to be right next to him gone. That's what they did to our manuscripts. People or things that are inside our manuscripts are then rewritten to write certain people out or write certain people in. Joseph's the father of Jesus in the original New Testament, and then he's written out as the father, and now Jesus has no Davidic lineage. The people who made this idiotic change don't realize they've taken away Jesus being the Messiah. But we Christians have to wake up. we got to wake up. And so I want you to understand, this is a Roman practice. This didn't come, the Soviets weren't the first to make it up. It was called damnatio memoriae. How can I damn your memory for the rest of eternity? I'm going to erase you and make you an unperson, basically, in modern terms. So I'm going to read this to you. Damnatio memoriae, the systematic removal of all evidence of a character's existence, either through the mundane conspiracy or a little bit of applied phlebotonym, that is laser-guided amnesia. I mean, this is sort of humorous webpage. The purpose for doing so varied. This is more commonly done in enclosed or isolated areas where it is easier to track evidence. This can lead to characters tracking the shreds of evidence the hiders left behind. Often, any shred of evidence they find will disappear when they show someone. If they dig too deep or get too involved in the research, there's always the danger that they too will disappear, depending on the circumstances. I think there's a little bit of sense of humor here. You've got to sometimes when you're looking at the macabre, you got to have a sense of humor. But there's still a lot of truth here. Damnatio memoriae, Latin for damnation of memory, often relies on the fact that history is written by the winners. And of course, the winners would always like to remove evidence of opposition against the rule as a warning for others and to perpetuate their power. So, as it says in George Orwell's book, whoever controls the past controls the present. Whoever controls the present controls the future. And how do you control the past? You control all the records. And if you can destroy the records, even better. Damnatio memoriae. It is also done for other purposes, such as literally condemning questionable acts done by the person in his lifetime to deter possible future offenders. Yes, in a sense, you can take someone who's not really done a real crime, but simply had a thought crime. And so this is another thing that George Orwell was talking about, thought crimes. And he's literally mocking Trinitarianism. And I'm sorry to tell you, Trinitarians, that's what he's doing with the 1984. But if you pay attention, you know he's doing that. He's taking the Roman Catholic way of basically not caring anymore, just simply punishing you for an act you did, but for the thoughts you're having. And the thoughts you were having that was illicit or criminal was believing there's one God. And if you believed there was one God and you didn't accept there were three gods in one, you were persecuted and ultimately killed. But they tried to convert you first. And if you would recant while they're ready to hang you, they'd spare your life. You say, I believe in Trinity, I believe in the Trinity, and they'll save your life. And now you can either live a cow the rest of your life that way, or you're going to have to go believe in something that violates all your ethics, that there's only one God. So this is the damnatio memoriae. We're going to destroy the memory of everything that's contrary to our current doctrine in the 325 period through 381. We're going to punish these people's thought patterns. And in one of the recent videos I showed you, there's actually at Nicaea, they prohibited certain phrases. You could no longer use certain phrases, and you had to use certain other phrases. So you weren't allowed to think a certain way. You must think a different way. And it took time to do that. Finally, here on this page, this trope, or this, what would you call that? A saying, is that traitors and other such undesirables in the Roman Empire were known to be given this treatment. So this is a very well-known pattern. And what do you do? Listen to this. The other Wikis articles on it shows that Roman murals that have unwanted people's faces were chiseled out of them. So imagine you've got an account you don't like about Jesus Christ's birth. You want him now to be changed for whatever reason, and it suits your interest. Now, I want to say this. The virgin birth was not created at the time of the Trinity doctrine that comes in 325. It was, though, adopted for a totally different purpose, to destroy the messiahship of Jesus and to so disconnect him from Joseph. But on top of that, add Jeconia into the Matthew account, which would disconnect Jesus completely, even if Joseph was his father, even if that got fixed at any point. Because now Jeconia, if that tradition could be put in there, then Jeconia would block it, because in Jeremiah 23:23 it says no heir of Jeconia will be on the throne. So whoever did this sabotaged us, and this is what the purpose of Matthew is, not the original Matthew, but the phony Matthew that comes up in around 140, 150. Luke, my belief is, I have a theory, is it was a one copy made, put into a file. It was a criminal appeal. And that's why it doesn't appear in any mention or character or any place until like 140, 150. And well, why is that? Because somebody said, hey, you know what? We can fix this. I think our church knew that Jeconian sabotage. How are we going to undo that? Well, what if we came out with a genealogy, the real one, and we created the real one, and it'll show Jeconia is not in the lineage, and we'll prove that Jesus is the heir of has a Davidic line all the way to David. So my theory is they did that, and then later, because so much popularity was hinged now on the virgin birth, how people love Christmas and all that, people gravitated to this story and they didn't want to let it go. So even the Lucan effort to correct things was itself reverted back to a virgin birth and written in that way. And you can see it's a much greater mismatch in Luke than it is in Matthew, by the way. There's so many inconsistencies in Luke between a virgin birth account in later things that are said in the book, and we'll see. So anyway, this is important for us to know. This is the pervasiveness that if you're living in the Roman Empire, this is how they control information. And there's all the indications that's what they did in this situation. All right, so now let's get to our story. Does Apostle John betray facts there was no virgin birth? We talked about in the prior episode 1 that Mary is living with him based on this passage at the cross, John 19, verse 26 to 27. Woman, here's your son. And to the disciple, Jesus says, here is your mother. And they lived together. And the story was that even when John got out of his prison on Patmos, he and Mary lived in Ephesus together till she died. Then we showed you the fact is that John puts a lot of emphasis on testimony. He has John the Baptist testify about Jesus. In fact, the heading in the Bible itself for John 1, verse 29 to 34, it says John testifies about Jesus. And if I highlighted 3 times, he mentions testimony, told me, and testify. And so John was supposed to be a piece of evidence or witness. So John, the apostle, understands that if Mary said something, could verify the virgin birth, then you would want to put that here. If that's something important, it's one of the most amazing miracles in the world history, right? If this really happened, you would expect it to be in his gospel, if anywhere. You might not even expect it to be in the other twos, but the guy who Mary lives with after Jesus' ascension is the one guy who you would expect to have the virgin birth, and he has nothing. And you're going to see he has something completely contrary. And we mentioned in the last episode 1, we said, hey, take a look here. You got John 1:45 and John 6:42, and Jesus is twice called son of Joseph, and none of that, supposed to be the son of Joseph type thing, which is, I think, an add-on into both Matthew and Luke. So but they didn't do that here. So did write of Jesus of Nazareth, and it should have said the supposed son of Joseph, but it doesn't do that. It just leaves it the way it is. And then I said, I just said, you can't, it's hard to imagine if Mary's living with him that she didn't have an opportunity to talk to him about Jesus. Okay. And there should be stories about the virgin birth. And there's actually a book called Mary's Voice in the Gospel According to John. And so this gentleman is fictionalizing, not fictionalizing, but imagining what would the conversations be between Mary and John, and which ones could have affected how John spoke in his gospel. The one thing he never thought about, it appears to me, is, well, why isn't there any mention of anything about the virgin birth positively or negatively? Actually, well, negatively we're going to find, but positively we don't find it here. But negatively, you're going to find the negative here. And here's the negative. So this is the point of this episode 2.1. I got a few others incongruities I want to talk to you about. And so this is in an article dealing with rejection through the gospel. And this person has nothing, she doesn't have any clue how this affects the virgin birth. And that's the beauty of it. When people say things and they're not even thinking of the consequences of what they say, that means it's more true than if I said it. So her name is Catlin Placencia. She's part of the Open Bible with Pastor Colin Smith. And she quotes, Scripture tells us that, quote, not even his brothers believed in him. That's a quote of John 7, verse 5. So Caitlin Placencia writes, Jesus' own family rejected him as the Messiah. In his life among us, Jesus was a son, a brother, maybe even an uncle. Now think of what she's saying. The family of Jesus, who had a virgin birth, where he was miraculously born without Joseph supposedly being the siring agent, and Mary having absolute knowledge from the beginning, allegedly, of her married life, that the Holy Spirit had chosen her son to be, this major figure of world history, and she's the custodian of this person, and God's going to give this person a special mission. All the reasons she does her Magnificat, all those things that are recited, and yet her own children don't believe Jesus is of any importance. They don't believe in him. They have not been prepared to accept him as the Messiah themselves. Would God want that kind of family? Did he pick the wrong person who has no ability to raise her children in the ways of the Lord? I mean, you would imagine it would be the one thing she would drill into them. And I'm going to be honest with you, she would never even let them, she would tell them who Jesus is from day one. I think that's what I would do if I was a mother of Jesus and I know all these things. It's insane that the kids don't know this. And so they should all just at least even give mouth service. Yes, we know our brother's going to grow up to be the Messiah, but we're keeping it kind of to our closer best. No, they don't believe in him. That's what it says, and she doesn't see the incongruity of it. So this is inconsistent with the virgin birth account for the very guy who's living with Mary for 20 years after the crucifixion, at least. Here's another commentary by a web page called The Scriptural Arguments Against the Virginal Conception. This is a 2007 article. It just mentions in passing, other contradiction between the Gospels and the virgin birth have been identified, and one of them is that Jesus' brothers did not believe in him, John 7:5. So I'm not the first one to see it. It's just once you see it, and I only found it recently, and I'm always on the hunt, but I hadn't seen it until like a few days ago. Now, what we need to know is this is not an isolated situation. So I did know about this other one, and I was waiting for the right time to go into it in more depth. And we're going to go into this a little bit because, I want to show you the credibility of the John 7:5 version, because it's even worse, meaning it's worse for the virgin birth claim when you read Mark. Now, this is the way this website puts it. Mark even suggests that Jesus' brother and mother thought that he was mad. And you're going to say that's impossible. Oh, yes. No, it is. I mean, it's not impossible. It's exactly what it says. This is in Mark verse 3, verse 21 and 31. Now, the only thing they've ever tried to do is try to change the word that means kinsmen, meaning family members, into the word friends, which is ridiculous. Okay. But that's all they've tried to do, because otherwise, whoever these people are, the kinsmen, it's not friends, but that's what I'm going to show you. It's how one Bible has translated it. And that is impossible. And so if it's kinsmen, they thought he had gone mad. And this actually was, you remember when Jesus is going out to Capernaum the first time, and his family is coming over to try to see him, and concerned of what's happening to him. In Mark, it's been downplayed. In Luke, it used to be exactly like it is in Mark, because Tertullian mentions this fact that his own family and his own mother did not attend to him, or were not attached to him, and didn't support him. So, I mean, I'm not even going to go into that passage from Tertullian. I've done that in another video. I've covered some of this before. So anyway, but let's get through this quickly so we can move on to, we've got 3 or 4 more others I want to show you. So here's how in 1885, I think it is 1885, the book of, let me see here, 1882, excuse me, in the Practical Commentary on the Gospel according to Mark by James Morrison, he mentions, so in, I think it's RSV, in that time, it used the word friends. And when his friends heard of it, they went out to lay on hold of him, and they said he's beside himself, meaning he's mad. Okay, so then he expounds on what does the words, and when his friends heard. Okay, so about what was going on. So he says, when reports reached them, meaning his kinsmen, men, regarding their kinsman, Jesus' persisted preachings and his fearless disputings with the ablest, let's move that there. So this is kinsman singular, persisted in preachings and his fearless disputings with the ablest and most learned of the scribes and Pharisees, and his actual selection of a band of 12 coadjutors and apostles, not to mention the rumors, the most daring exorcism and cures. So at the very point when Jesus is, having this confrontation with all these leaders and doing cures and miracles and all this stuff, his family think he's gone mad. Okay, the kinsmen. Okay, so let's go to example here. Number 2 here is, so they're mentioning, or he mentions, Morrison mentions, the expression is rendered his friends has caused perplexity to many critics, unnecessarily, however. So he's going to tell you this is not hard. This is easy. It literally means they who were from beside him, that is, in this connection, they who were by origin or birth from beside him, they who were closely connected with him by birth. That's what it means. He says it's not a disputable issue. And let's see what he says next. He says it is quite an appropriate phrase to denote one's kinsmen, men. So the term is translated by Wycliffe. So the term is translated by Wycliffe as kinsman. The Geneva has the corresponding word kinsfolks. Tyndale meant to bring out the same idea when he rendered the expression that they longed unto him, that is, they that belonged to him. And this is interesting, and Luther missed the mark and misled Coverdale, let me just see here, when he rendered the phrase that they were about him, just about him. So instead, it's like these people are surrounding him rather than kinsmen. And then he starts going through the list. Krebs renders it as kindred, and we'll go through all these. Okay, so you see, it's overwhelmingly clear that it just means kinsman. So this is identical. So let's go back here. So when it says Jesus' brothers did not believe in him, and we over here have his kinsmen, which include his mother. His mothers and his brothers and sisters are all there. And the kinsman means all your family members. It doesn't exclude Mary. It's not your brothers and sisters. That's be brothers and sisters. This was kinsman, your kinfolk. Though that means your family. So just think about your family members is really what it means in English. They're around you. They're coming there because they think you've gone mad. You're beside yourself is what it literally says in Greek, but it means you've gone mad. You've lost your mind, because they couldn't understand why he's putting himself in this position where he's talking to all these people and having sophisticated dialogue. This is not something they've ever seen him do before. So just to show you, it was shocking them to the core, and they thought he'd gone crazy. And that's what you end up getting. And so that's not a family that a virgin birth ever touched. By no means in the stretch of this God's green earth. So that it's a fraud. It never happened. That could, and you right? If those passages in John and in Mark are true, which they are, they say the same thing, there was never a virgin birth in that family. Thank God, because we can honestly tell the world that Jesus was born of Joseph, and therefore he is the heir to the Davidic throne. Now we got to deal with why is Jeconiah in there, and that's the next issue. But we can win that one too, because the honest truth, as I believe, is that the true account is Luke, because that was our church saying, okay, we have to defeat this any way we can. Somebody go do a lineage on Joseph and show that his lineage goes through a different line, not Jeconiah's line. Because by the way, it's easy to get around a line but you have to find it. So that's what I think they did, and I don't believe they would have lied, and they did a good job, and I believe Luke is the right account, just so you know. And whoever made up the Matthew account, he didn't care about any accuracy whatsoever, and he just made up stuff. All right, now we move on. That was 2.1, and that's a big chunk of this. 2.2, Ehrman, he says, he wrote an article on the virgin birth in the Gospel of John. He says it doesn't mention the virgin birth, and nothing in it presupposes a virgin birth. But he did not notice what I told you about John 7:5. And then here's this article, Scriptural Arguments Against the Virginal Conception. And the way this article put it, it is extremely difficult to accept that Mark and John could not have known of Mary's miraculous conception, yet they had good knowledge of Jesus' life. So, okay, so there's incongruity. How could they not know Jesus' life enough to know whether he had a virgin birth or not? So they conclude either one, they, Mark and John, did not know much about Jesus' life, or two, they knew about the story of the virginal conception, but deliberately ignored it because they did not believe it. But I came up with the third option, and I think it's the correct one. And there's two potential options, A and B. Or three, it was not true, but A, fabricated after the close of Mark and John into Matthew, meaning John never knew about it. John's dead, 96 AD. This is all being concocted around 140 AD in my estimation, about 140 to 160, to sabotage Christianity with no Davidic line for Jesus, so he can't be Messiah, and throw in Jeconiah for good measure, somebody that God cursed in the Davidic line, his line within the Davidic line would never have an heir sitting on the throne of David, which would indeed block Jesus, and hence Jesus would never be Messiah. And this fits the heretic Marcion. Marcion was a competing heretic, and he did not believe Jesus was Messiah. But you're going to see one more interesting thing. And B, and both these two things are true at the same time. B, and at the same time, he created the story Jesus was born with a God indwellment from birth, not at his baptism, suitable to Marcion's deity view of Jesus. So the strange thing about Marcion, and if you don't know who he is, he was a Paul-only Christian who came to the view there's two gods. There's God the Father. There's God Yahweh, who's the just God, but that's a bad thing because justice means you have to send people to hell, so you're a bad person for doing that, supposedly. And the just appears a baby, but he'll be exactly what we want, God the Son from birth. And that may have been what they were thinking, although that's not, I'm not saying that's exactly clear either in John as well. All right. So here we go. Then here's another verse. So there's another argument in favor of viewing that the virgin birth is not in John. There was this interchange with Jews. Then the Jews who were hostile to Jesus, not all Jews are hostile to Jesus, just some were hostile to Jesus, began complaining about him because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. And they said, isn't this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, I have come down from heaven? John 6, 41, 42. What Jesus said, John the apostle says the word came to dwell in Jesus. The word was God. So the voice speaking here is probably really God speaking. I am the bread of life. I've come down from heaven, just so we're clear. Regardless, the point is this says son of Joseph. It doesn't say the supposed son of Joseph, which in Matthew and Luke, even if a third person said it in this context, there would be a parenthetical that would say, which the speaker supposed was, his father, that kind of thing. Not present here. Okay. So either they didn't think it was worth the time to do it, or they didn't want to tamper with John's gospel, which is more what I think happened. And because also it came later in time, it was harder to destroy it because it was circulating later in time and maybe in places they couldn't control because he was living in Ephesus, way outside of Jerusalem. So it was maybe outside the power centers of Roman influence in the Middle East. Okay, so now number 2.5. So that's We skipped that. We finished 3 points now, or 4 points. We're on the 5th point. The fact that the earliest and latest Gospels contain nothing at all about Jesus' early life probably mean that the authors had no knowledge of that history. So I just want to comment is some people claim in this article I'm looking at scriptural arguments against the virginal conception. They're trying to say that because they don't mention the virgin birth, they didn't have any knowledge of it. Okay, well, the thing is that we have to admit that if Mary lives with John, which she does, because that's how it ends this crucifixion, then John would have to know of the virgin birth account if it were true. So that's important. There's no conception where it's impossible that if it's really true that he didn't know about it because he's living with Mary. Ergo, if he doesn't mention it, or as we've seen, he includes facts in his gospel that are completely contrary to the virgin birth account, such as the children of Mary do not believe in Jesus as Messiah. I mean, that just can't not be if she was the mother, have had a virgin birth, raised all these children, and she never instilled in them that he was some important figure in the future and was going to fulfill these roles of being Messiah and other things that obviously God is speaking to her and saying all these things to her. I mean, or an angel, excuse me. So the answer is no. If he was ignorant, it means it didn't happen. If he knew about it, he would have disclosed it. That's all that's all you need to know. So he didn't know if he didn't know about it, it means it didn't happen. If he did know about it and didn't disclose it, that would be a crime, right? Because he's speaking to the woman directly, and she would be another witness, a testifier, just like John the Baptist he mentioned twice or 3 times was a testifying to the facts in support of Jesus. That means John would have to use Mary as a witness to testify to him and then to us through John's pen to the virgin birth. But that never happens, and that doesn't make any sense if it were true. So what you would expect to happen, that John records Mary talking to him and giving him information, ending up in the Gospel of John. If that isn't there, it's because it never happened. And then B. Then this same article says Matthew and Luke, Mark's and John's complete silence about Jesus' early history also raises serious questions about the credibility of these 2 books, but it does not say anything about the credibility of the story of the virginal conception. All right, just so you know, is the Islamic people, they believe from the Quran in the virgin birth. They don't really care whether our gospels get it right or wrong. They don't want the virgin birth to ever be disproved because that would put their scripture in jeopardy. So they want the virgin birth to be true. So what I'm saying here doesn't please them, I'm sure. But that's not my goal, is not to please Islamic people. My goal is to help us as Christians get Jesus back on the Davidic lineage line. And the Muslims are not going to help us get Jesus's Davidic lineage back. We've got to fight for it. We've got to prove it. And we got to stop thinking that this is heresy. This is not heresy. The heresy is to have gotten rid of the virgin birth count. And we've got to be committed to understanding that has to be restored. We have to restore the text that Joseph begat Jesus. It's in the earliest Bible that was found by Agnes Lewis. We have the books. She went there with experts from world-renowned experts, 3 other guys from Cambridge University. They found this in 1845. It's a fantastic proof that Joseph begat Jesus. Joseph begat Jesus and Justin twice. He died in 165 AD. Remember I told you the destruction of all the records from the early church were almost complete, but they missed Justin. And they didn't find this one book in a monastery. But if they could have, they would have. So we are blessed by God to have these things. And there's many other references. So let's move on. All right. So in my view, I think I've told you this before, is Marcionite. I'm going to take a. Okay. So this is part 2.7. I think this is the last section of the argument, and then we're done. But it's going to take a little while. But I think this is going to be useful for everybody. Now, we all know that Matthew has an account where, and I don't believe this is Matthew writing, and it's an account that says that Isaiah 7 verse 14 is talking about a virgin, and a virgin gives birth, and that means with no, the way he was applying in that case was that Joseph didn't have to be the father, and that you could literally have a woman who has no relations with a man who has a child. I think we're all clear on that. And that this allegedly fulfilled the prophecy that's in Isaiah 7. Now, I've in a prior couple of episodes, I had early Christianity explain this to you in a video. It's impossible. It's not true. You just have to read Isaiah 7 and chapter 8, and you walk away and go, how in the world did anyone make up this story? But you know what? I'm gonna make you listen to this one more time. It's written out in text form, and so I didn't do that last time. I let the early Christianity person do it. So you're gonna have a chance to freeze frame these screens, read them, or do something, and I'm gonna try to copy this into the description so you can follow what the point is. And so it's conclusive, is what I'm trying to tell you, that there is nothing to what was said. It's not a prophecy that would go into be of a virgin or anything. And it was Isaiah's wife, and they named their kid Emmanuel. I mean, how can we just ignore that? That's in chapter 8. So we're just living in a fantasy where we don't read the context. And I can't explain to you why the people who are our shepherds and our pastors either themselves don't read it or don't care, or just don't, they think there's dual prophecies about everything. This isn't even a prophecy about a Messiah. This has nothing to do with Messiah. So I'm just expounding. Let's read it together. But I want you to understand, I believe this was put in there to make a sabotage of our Bible. And so we're falling into sabotage when we're letting someone dupe us into defending something that's indefensible. And I think that's another thing is Marcion and Theodotion. Theodotion was a Marcionite. He lived in Sinope, at the same city where Marcion lived, and Theodotion was a top-ranked expert translator from Hebrew to Greek, which means he could go look at the Hebrew Matthew in Caesarea, get permission to go in because he's a world-class translator, and he's famous. And he's in the Hexapla of Oregon, okay, and that's how famous he is. And so he goes in there, he starts translating away, and we don't know what his project is. He and Marcion have concocted this whole plan of destroying Christianity, what we follow. They're angry, they're upset. He was excluded and not excommunicated, but just said, we don't want your money. He offered like 60,000, I think it's called sesterces, and we said, no, you're evil, blah, blah, blah. And his revenge was to do what we're seeing. And so using the Isaiah story was just one way of humiliating us, because it's so ridiculous that we did this. And you'll see. So I'm going to read this out. I'm going to read this to you, and you'll see the story. The real problem in Matthew's use of Isaiah's prophecy is that he takes it completely out of context in order to apply it to Jesus' conception. Around 735 BCE, Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, king of the northern kingdom of Israel, formed an alliance against the threat of invasion by the neighboring superpower of Assyria. They wanted Ahaz, king of the southern kingdom of Judea, to join their coalition. Now, I think I've said this recently too, is there were two kingdoms. Israel split into two, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom is known as kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom was called the kingdom of Israel. Sometimes here he's calling it the northern kingdom of Israel. So it's just maybe a little confusing. So I thought I'd explain that. So they wanted Ahaz, king of the southern kingdom of Judea, to join their coalition. But Ahaz, the king, was fearful of becoming Assyria's enemy. Rezin and Pekah then sent their armies to depose Ahaz and install a new king in the southern kingdom of Israel, of Judea, to install a new king who would join the alliance. Ahaz thought of allying himself with Assyria to seek its powerful protection against Rezin and Pekah's advancing armies towards Jerusalem. God sent prophet Isaiah to allay Ahaz's fears and give him a sign. A young woman will give birth to a boy called Emmanuel. And before this boy is old enough to differentiate between right and wrong, the lands of Rezin and Pekah would be destroyed. Okay, so that's a prophecy that's going to happen within the time it takes the boy to reach age 12 to 13, as was very well explained in the study of Christianity by that young man who did a very fantastic exposition on this. So you can go back to those videos we've done on this before and listen to him say it. It may be better than I'm putting it. I hope I'm doing justice. I'm just reading it. I hope it's clear. But it goes on. So here's the actual prophecy. So listen to it, and then with that context, you're going to see it's nothing to do with the Messiah or virgin birth or any of these things. Sad. For this reason, the sovereign master himself will give you a confirming sign. Look, this young woman is about to conceive. So this is a pregnancy that was already existing at this moment, just so you know, in the verb tenses. And it's true. Isaiah's wife was already pregnant with this child who would be called Emmanuel. One of his names will be Emmanuel. Is about to conceive and will give birth to a son. You, young woman, will name him Emmanuel. He will eat sour milk and honey, which will help him know how to reject evil and choose what is right. Here is why this will be so. Before the child knows how to reject evil and choose what is right, the land whose two kings you fear will be desolate. So that's what it was a prophecy of. The sign would be the child be being born and being given this name. And before he reaches age 12, 13, both these kingdoms that are threatening him would be gone, and they indeed were. And it's so this young man in Study Christianity, that video article, he shows you the timeline of when those two countries became defunct. It's without even firing a shot. Judah, kingdom of Judah in the south, was protected. Okay, so let's go back to the reading. The text goes on to talk about the events that would follow. Matthew, and I say it's Marcion or it's Theodotion, has completely misused Isaiah's prophecy in applying it to Jesus' birth. First, there was nothing special or miraculous about the conception or birth that Isaiah described. That's right. She's already pregnant. It's not a question. And it's using the word for young woman, not young virgin. Second, the birth was not significant, as it was only a sign to Ahaz about a future event. Third, that birth would be a sign only if it happened during Ahaz's lifetime. Fourth, while Isaiah talked about a child called Emmanuel, Isaiah 7:14 is the one we're all famous for, but take a look at 8, verse 8. Jesus is never actually called Emmanuel. So again, if that's supposed to fulfill a prophecy, why didn't that happen there? It had happened in Isaiah's life, but why is it not happening in Jesus' life? So you know it didn't get fulfilled. I mean, is that not obvious? All right, let's continue. He's not actually called Emmanuel anywhere in the New Testament. The context of Isaiah's prophecy could not be clearer. So Matthew, and I say seek, meaning error. I don't think it's Matthew speaking. I think it's this Marcion or Theodotion character in sabotaging our texts. Must have consciously decided to take the prophecy out of context. Well, yes, whoever did this did it deliberately. These are not mistakes. These are viciously poor readings. I mean, ridiculously absurd readings of the text. I just want to see something. Yeah, okay. So you couldn't miss it in a million years. Only Christians, when we've been embedded with this idea, this has to be about Jesus, so that we just close our minds. We don't read the prophecy. If you just look on the screen at 7:14 to 16, just reading it. If you read it objectively, you would know it has nothing to do with Jesus Christ. It has nothing to do with him. It's about this situation at this time, and it's going to be done by the time this young man reaches 12 to 13. And did Jesus, when he arrived at age 12 to 13, did something happen where the enemies of southern part of Judah went away? No. So it would not be about Jesus even if you tried to apply it to Jesus. Do you see? So it's ridiculous. Whoever put this in there did it to make us look like fools, and we have looked like fools now for 2 millennia. And that's what angers me too. Marcion and Theodotion have made us look like idiots because we defended the indefensible. We just pretended like we can't see the words on the page. They're screaming at us that this doesn't apply, but we keep insisting. And I keep hearing people coming back and say, no, isn't there a way? And they want to argue about whether Alma is a young woman or virgin or whatever. Look at the words. It doesn't even depend on the word virgin or young woman. You just tell this is not about Jesus Christ. Even if you thought it was a virgin birth with Isaiah's wife. That's the only, and by the way, they'd already had one son, so she's not a virgin, just to put that issue to rest. But even so, none of the other things happened with Jesus, so this is just a myth. And there was nothing about the birth of the child was unusual in the prophecy. That wasn't what was unusual. It was just simply there's a kid, he's about to be born, his name's gonna be Emmanuel. Count about 12 to 13 years and tell me, God's saying, "Tell me if that sign didn't prove true, that your enemies would be defeated and you wouldn't have had to lift up a finger." That's it. That's the prophecy. Nothing about a Messiah, nothing about somebody conquering as a Messiah, nothing, 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 zero. Just forget it. This was a mistake. Whoever did this was wrong. And if it was Matthew, I it couldn't be Matthew, right? He's not gonna make a blunder like this. So this could only have been someone like Marcion or Theodotion. That's actually one of my main proofs that it was someone like Marcion or Theodotion. And I also believe they did it deliberately because how do I know? Because Theodotion translated Isaiah himself from Hebrew to Greek. And he, by the way, he fixed it. When he went from Hebrew for young woman, he's one of the examples. When you translate it, you can translate it into either into Parthenos, which means virgin, primarily means virgin, or you can translate it into a word meaning young woman. And he, Theodotion, chose young woman. So he knew how to play with that one. He knew the Septuagint had translated it with the word Parthenos, but he was going to translate it correctly as young woman when he's doing his own Hebrew Bible to Greek. But he knew the Septuagint had the error, so he's going to throw in the poor translation of the Septuagint as well to misguide us. And then we would end up defending the Septuagint as a superior Bible, which is ridiculous. It's a terrible translation. Anyway, so let's just go now to the end here, and I'm going to let you go. So here's a recap of what we found today. So we've got 7 points, and I'll make them as quick as I can. Jesus' brothers did not believe in him, is in John 7, verse 5. Therefore, it is impossible to believe the virgin birth is true, because John would have had Mary's own words as proof, as she lived with him, with John post-crucifixion. And that means he would have known from her that there was a virgin birth, and that he would question himself, because where is he getting this from? He's got to get this from Mary. So let's say Mary says to him that Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him. Brothers and sisters is probably what that's saying in full context. And wouldn't John have said, that doesn't make sense if you had a virgin birth? And she could have said yay or nay. So it just couldn't happen. He wouldn't, if she said there was a virgin birth, he would take this out, because it just wouldn't make sense to the audience, and maybe there'd be too many explanations and so on. But obviously there was no virgin birth, because it doesn't make sense that none of the children would believe in Jesus in any way, that he was Messiah or whatever Mary was told by the angels. 2, nothing in John's gospel presupposes Jesus had a virgin birth. The reader has to alone bring that as an assumption in reading it. 3, only 3 possibilities exist why John was silent. A, he did not know of a virgin birth. B, he knew of it but did not believe in it. Or C, which is what I think is true, Matthew and Luke, without Davidic conception, are corruptions added post 96 AD. I think that's what happened. 2.4, John 6, verse 41 to 42, we see twice Jesus is the son of Joseph. Why would he say that without adding the proverbial, as it was supposed, somewhere in there, so we wouldn't get the wrong idea that Jesus had a natural birth through a Davidic father? 2.5, the silence of John on the virgin birth cannot be because he does not know whether it's true or false. He lived with Mary for years post-crucifixion, so he had to know the answer to the question. Is there a virgin birth or not? And my view is, well, you see in the next one. 2.6, the charge that John is not credible due to not reflecting the virgin birth account is false. So some people attack John as like, if he can't tell us about the virgin birth account, then the whole book of John should be disputed, because like he has to know, right? I mean, he was married. The reason is this: he lived with Mary and knew whether she spoke to him about it. So that's a fact. His silence rather reflects on the post 96 AD timing of the fabricator. So in other words, the reason he doesn't write about it is because he doesn't know about it, because it never happened. And the virgin birth account is fabricated after 96 AD. John dies in 96 AD. The fabrication occurs after 96 AD, probably another 30, 40 years later. Okay. And so the fabricator has to then bring 2 sabotage elements. He's going to bring that Jeconiah is in the line of the genealogy, and he's going to cut out Joseph as the father, and that's going to end Jesus as being a Messiah, right? and he doesn't believe in his Marcion religion. He doesn't believe Jesus is Messiah. So remember, he's making us line up with him. See, and this is what I'm saying is, in order to figure out this mystery, you have to know the Marcionite religion, and a lot of people don't, and it's a very bizarre religion to believe in. It's a Paul onlyism, dispensationalism on top of everything else. So it's got like everything going. You've got tons of stuff to figure out. Anyway, had John ever read Matthew, and John died in 96 AD, and by the way, the Hebrew Matthew was written around 37 AD, scholars early on had concluded, John would have objected to Jeconiah and the cutting out of Joseph. So in other words, if the virgin birth account was really there, John would never have left it alone, because he could see, but through the Holy Spirit, that the Holy Spirit revealed to him is Jeconiah is in that line. The lineage written is wrong. Okay. And then you have to connect Joseph. So what he would have said to himself, oh, if Matthew really wrote this, this needs to be fixed. And he would have said, let's put Joseph back in as the father, because Jesus, that's who I understood is the father of Jesus. That's how come he's Messiah, Davidic heir. And then this Jeconiah thing, can we double check and make sure that what is the lineage of Jesus through the line to David? Because if it's Jeconiah, Jesus would be disqualified. And John says, why would God go to all this trouble to have Jeconiah in the line? So let's go do some homework. That's what John would do. He'd come into town in Jerusalem and say, let's fix this. None of that happened. And so it tells me that the virgin birth account didn't even exist in Matthew when he died in 96 AD, because that would have all been fixed. 2.7, John could not allow the misuse of Isaiah 7:14, a non-prophecy about Isaiah's own wife having a son named Emmanuel, and Jesus never was named that, where the prophecy was fulfilled by the time Emmanuel became of age, when Assyria fell, or these Pekah and the other guy falls centuries earlier. So the Isaiah prophecy is fulfilled long earlier, and John, if he saw that there's this quotation of Isaiah 7:14 that's being taken out of context, totally being abusing the meaning of the text, taking it out of context, applying it to somebody who couldn't be that, and it was never fulfilled with Jesus. There was no end of the enemies of Judah within 13, 14 years of Jesus' birth. So it has to happen by his 14th year. You'd have to find somewhere in the 14th year that the enemies of Judea, were destroyed, like Rome went away, and that never happened. So you see, it just doesn't fit. It's a story that doesn't fit. So he would have not allowed this to be in the Bible. So the third thing he would have done after he fixed the Jeconiah thing and put Joseph back in as the father of Jesus, he would have said, you know what, we got to get rid of this Isaiah 7:14 thing, because it makes Matthew, if Matthew wrote this is craziness. This has to be removed. And that would have been his third change. All right, everybody. I hope this helps you understand the virgin birth account is incongruous with the book of John. And it's incongruous. You saw here, again, I've said it before, it's incongruous with Mark and the fact that Jesus' own family, including his mother, think he's gone crazy when he's trying to go on his first mission into Capernaum, where, he's got his 12 apostles with him, and he's got all these healings and miracles and all this stuff. And the scribes and the Pharisees are all out after him, and all this hectic, he went from this quiet carpenter assistant type young man, and now he's doing all this religious stuff. So in other words, Mary and the kids had no idea who he was, really. God's came down him at his baptism, and it changed his life. And that's when it started, and that's why he emerged suddenly, and his own family had no expectation. And frankly, maybe Jesus didn't even really have a true expectation of this was happening. And then the dove comes into his body. The Father comes to dwell in him. And that's when the monogenes, when you see John 1:1 and 1:14 and 1:18 of the prologue of John, that's what the monogenes is. It's the one and only Father, the Word, coming into a dwelling in Jesus. And he dwelt in flesh. We just read it wrong. We're just reading it from these preconceived notions about Trinitarianism instead of the way. Just don't bring anything into it and just read it without using your Trinitarian concepts. Just read it, and you'll see it's the Word was God. God came to dwell in flesh. And it's exactly what happens at the baptism, not at his birth. Okay, everybody, I hope that helped you. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.